Hi. Hi there. Yep, so we're going to start in 3 or 4 minutes' time.
Oh, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening to wherever you are. Welcome to this IDS online event on the COVID-19 crisis facing informal workers. I'm Peter Taylor, Director of Research at IDS, and I'll be chairing this event. We have an excellent panel of speakers who I'll be introducing in just a moment as I invite each to speak. And welcome to all participants, wherever you are, whatever time zone you are, wherever region or country you may be, joining us on Zoom or YouTube. We'll be starting off today with a round of interventions from our panelists, and then we'll be opening up for a round of questions and or comments from participants. And if you have a question or comment, please enter it into the chat function. And with help from my colleagues, we'll aim to collate and channel as many of your questions to the panelists so that we can have an active engagement on this important issue. And why this event today? Well, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on the health and economies of countries all over the world. And some of the hardest hit have been low-income, informal sector workers. On this event, we'll discuss the impacts the global pandemic has had so far, how they can be mitigated, and the longer-term implications for the informal sector. And as countries begin to look ahead to rebuilding their economies, are there any opportunities for positive change? So we're going to start by having two speakers from our panel who will talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on informal workers. They're both going to talk for about 5 minutes each, and I'll introduce both before they start, and then after them, I'll introduce the following panelists. So we're going to start with Hina Sheikh, and Hina is country economist with the International Growth Center in Pakistan, And her research interests include public policy around the development and social sector, particularly social protection, education and poverty, and urban service delivery. And she's also worked on the political economy of reforms and civil service reforms, particularly focused on improving service delivery. And then we're going to follow Hina with Amrita Saha. And Amrita is an economist, a research fellow here at IDS, with a focus on political economy and development. She works with the rural futures and business markets and state clusters at IDS, and her ongoing research explores the political economy of trade protection, agricultural commercialization in sub-Saharan Africa, and innovation and inclusive structural change. So Hina, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just going to get straight to the point in the interest of time. So what is so unique about the situation of informal workers that merits such, attention and focus? It mostly has to do with the way that they're embedded in the society, in what they do, how they live, which makes them more susceptible to certain vulnerabilities, which have been exposed under the current pandemic. So why did we have to wait for a pandemic to start recognizing the plight of informal workers and begin a policy conversation around it? Well, unlike in most previous instances of a recession or an economic shock, the informal economy has mostly chugged along just fine without any major disruptions. But now those same workers are unable to continue doing what they had been doing. And all of a sudden, their contribution to the economy in the form of delivering essential services, providing cheap labor, has become more visible. And policymakers hence want to address these vulnerabilities so they can remain productive in whatever limited way possible during this time, and and actively, contribute to the economy in the future as well. Today, we have around 60% of all workers, around 2 billion, globally are informally employed. In fact, the informal economy predominates in many countries that include sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, Latin America, ranging from anywhere between 50 to 85, 90%. And for a great majority of informal workers, such as daily wages, home-based workers, domestic employees, street vendors, migrant laborers, work is a hand-to-mouth struggle for survival. And not working basically means not being able to eat. So orders to stay at home, a shrinking consumption, declining demand for goods produced both locally and exported has cut informal sector earnings by nearly 60% globally just in the first month of the pandemic. So while it is important to focus on the headline figures, it is just as important to understand the channels through which COVID impacts economy and creates groups of newly vulnerable. So the first thing is that this pandemic is both a health and an economic shock, and both these tend to reinforce each other. So in fact, in many developing countries, including in South Asia and Africa, they began to feel the economic shock way before the health impact. Containment measures were put in place even before the cases began to spike, which meant that actually the informal economy was one of the first actual victims of the virus, while the health impact of the virus imposes both direct and indirect, economic costs, the containment measures result in a direct loss of livelihood and can have long-term impacts on socioeconomic health of the population. For example, when children miss out on their vaccinations or are unable to go to school. Secondly, it can result in both a temporary and a permanent loss of income. And while we may not have enough information at this point to predict how many will retain a secure job when this pandemic is over, for many, the loss of livelihood could be long term. For example, in India, they have demolished street vending infrastructure in many places. Local governments have done that. So that kind of indicates a permanent loss of income. But even a temporary loss in income without any savings or assets to fall back on can have a devastating consequence for those whose livelihoods are based on a hand-to-mouth subsistence. Thirdly, informal employees are more likely to be poor and prone to poverty. 1 in every 4 poor household in Bangladesh, for example, is engaged in informal activity. And while the disease does not differentiate between the rich or the poor, unequal access to healthcare, education, work from home options, online schooling, access to health insurance makes the poor far less resilient to these shocks caused by such outbreaks. So, in fact, some estimates have suggested that COVID-19 can be up to 10 times more deadly for the poor. Informal workers are also more likely to live in conditions where the health risk is amplified. Physical distancing may be impossible to practice in informal settlements like slums or crowded neighborhoods. They may also lack access to clean drinking water, sanitation facilities. Informal workers, they're also engaged in work where social distancing is difficult, for example, in a factory setup or a construction site. They also lack access to coping mechanisms. We all know that they're usually unable to access social protection and labor legislation as they are not officially acknowledged as workers, which means that they are working without contracts, or they don't have access to social insurance or any kind of safety net or simple labor rights. So another angle to how they're impacted is the gender dimension. Currently, in more than half of the countries that have been impacted by COVID, the percentage of women working in the informal economy exceeds the percentage of men. And they're finding it harder to retain their current jobs due to an increase in childcare responsibilities as schools and childcare centers remain closed. The virus also tends to impact the informal youth more. ILO has estimated that almost 77% of the young workers were in informal jobs compared to 60% of the adult workers. So such workers risk being, scarred by the effects of the lockdown for a much longer after it ends. So even when the economy restarts, no one can predict how quickly it'll bounce back to push demand for such jobs. So I'm just going to conclude. In many informal workers earn just above the poverty level, and without any support, they're very likely to fall back or fall into poverty due to the economic impacts of COVID-19. For families already living in poverty, these impacts can be a shock to their long-term economic stability, their ability to work, earn a living, and raise a healthy family. So we need to think about these long-term repercussions. We must consider this is an opportunity to revisit and reshape how we view and regard informal work. We must also understand that naturally, countries with pervasive informality are less likely to have the institutional and fiscal capacity to, come up with an effective response to this. So we will need to find ways to work around this. I'll end here.
Thanks, Hina. So you've given us a good sense of the scale and the nature of the impact. Amrita, can I turn to you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about your perception of which sector and which groups are most likely to feel this impact, and where does vulnerability arise most?
Thanks, Peter. So just I think carrying on from what Hina was saying, with the severe disruptions that we've seen from COVID-19, the small businesses and workers in the informal economy with the insufficient resources as well as contingency plans have been particularly vulnerable. Now, the significance of the informal economy, however, varies across countries as well as sectors. So, for example, about 86% Africans are working in the informal sector, specifically in agriculture and food processing, but also in jobs in retail, trade, transport, and construction. If we look, say, and as another example, to Caribbean countries, this share is about 30%. And in sectors such as agriculture and primarily tourism. As a third example, we could look at Pacific countries, and about 50 to 80%, also a very, very high proportion, is in informal employment, driven mainly by tourism, but also transport and handicrafts. So what we see is that, while lockdown restrictions and supply chain disruptions have affected the informal sectors, the informal economy as a group, I think both directly as well as indirectly, the impact is fairly varied. So the tourism sector is directly hit, but also we are now looking at supply chain disruptions, which is affecting, processing jobs, related to agriculture or even down the supply chain. Now, the second aspect to this is that policies such as health measures, as well as economic and financial responses have been announced as well as implemented across a lot of these countries. But again, what we find is that there's a considerable variation in the types of policies that we have seen. And when it comes to the scope for the informal sector in terms of coverage in these policies, both direct, so for example, for small businesses and firms, as well as indirect, so for households or individuals, workers, has again been very varied. So when we look to various policy trackers of the ILO or IGC, for example, we see that, for example, Nigerian government is providing additional loans to traders, to artisans. In Ghana, loans are available to informal traders to revive their businesses. An example from Pacific, in Fiji, informal sector has been entitled to this one-off relief payments from the government. Utility fee waivers are also available. However, what is interesting is the scope for the informal sector is not always clearly defined on the policy. So, for example, if there is a utility fee waiver, the cover of that waiver will depend to a large extent on how much, for example, these populations are covered with electricity or have internet access. So even where policies are available, they have been announced, access to these for the informal sector is not going to be straightforward and will depend to a large extent on what is the existing scenario, what is the available infrastructure in country. So for example, going back to this utility fee waivers, they will be effective where there is sufficient coverage for internet or electricity. And in Africa, for example, we see that in a lot of countries still have only about 30% of their population in areas covered with good quality access to internet. Similarly, if we think about the short-term cover from these policy responses to protect against some of these adverse impacts, as well as, let's say, the medium to more longer-term effects, it will again depend on various factors. So what is, for example, the existing coverage of social protection and labor programs? In countries such as South Africa, there is quite sufficient coverage from these programs. But this coverage is, again, on the other end, quite low in countries such as Zambia. Where there is existing coverage, there are dependable channels for the informal sector workers or households to access these measures. For more longer term effects, we could ask, or question the fiscal space that is available across governments that has also implications. And the question about structural reduction of these finance gaps will be kind of driven by a combination of financial as well as non-financial measures such as training and so on. So the policy responses or the combination of policies that are being announced, the variation in them is going to directly affect the implications and the differences we see. So the combination of the various lockdown restrictions, the significance of the informal sector, which is varied, as well as the differences or the differential responses and existing preparedness has led to some countries and some sectors being more vulnerable than others. And considering and accounting for these differences as we see developments over the next months and account for these, especially considering structural policies to address some of these differences would be key in sort of this, building back better after some of these impacts have been mitigated. With that, I'll end my response. Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita, and thanks for building so well on Hina's intervention as well. So you've already started to bring us a little bit into ideas about how these economic impacts might be mitigated. And now I'd like to turn to our next panelist, Stephen Devereux, to say a bit more on this. Stephen's a research fellow at IDS and co-director of the Centre for Social Protection. He works mainly on food security, famine, and social protection. He's currently based in South Africa, where he works with the Centre of Excellence in Food Security. So, Stephen, over to you, please.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks to my fellow panelists. I think what I'm going to say actually follows on quite nicely from what Hina and Amrita have already started talking about. So I'm going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on social protection systems. And I think what's clear is that it's actually exposed a major gap in social protection systems across the world, but especially in countries that do not yet have comprehensive social protection coverage. And what do I mean by the gap? Well, most social protection systems have got two pillars. Firstly, you get social assistance, which provides social grants and cash transfers to non-working vulnerable groups, children, older persons, persons with disability, and so on. And then you have social insurance, which covers formally employed workers with pension schemes, unemployment insurance, and so on. But low-income informal workers, self-employed workers, gig workers, those category of people who don't have formal contracts have no access to either social assistance or social insurance. And that's a huge gap which COVID-19 has really exposed. So why are informal workers especially vulnerable? Well, of course, COVID-19 started off by being a health crisis and created a health problem across the world, but it also led to an economic crisis and a social crisis. mainly triggered by public responses to the pandemic, especially the lockdowns, because the lockdowns basically killed economic activity. Low-income informal workers have been badly affected because they've lost their income. Most of them cannot work from home. They're often in service sector jobs where they need to be out and about and interacting with people. They have limited savings and they have no access to social security. So they are almost the worst affected group in terms of the economic impacts, and they are the least protected group in terms of social protection. The good news is that COVID-19 has drawn attention to this gap in social protection for informal workers and has opened a policy window to start addressing it. So I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 countries and what they've done in response to this gap. I'll start with the UK, since IDS is based in the UK. There was, of course, the famous furlough scheme, meaning that people who were formally employed on a PAYE payroll were protected by what's called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, where the government basically underwrote up to 80% of people's incomes while they were sitting at home and not working. And soon after that program was introduced, a second category of income protection was the Coronavirus Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, which targeted self-employed workers, recognizing that they wouldn't be protected by the job retention scheme. And those workers can claim a taxable grant worth up to 80% of their profits of their small enterprises, up to £2,500 a month for 6 months. And about half of the 5 million self-employed people in the UK registered for this grant, and it's cost the UK government about £7.7 billion so far. So quite an effective response. It came a little bit later, but it did actually reach out to the informal workers who are typically excluded from formal social security systems. My next example is Ethiopia, which has a much more rudimentary social protection system than the UK, but also responded to COVID-19 with 2 shock responsive mechanisms to protect the poor. Shock responsive means you increase the amount transferred to existing beneficiaries of social protection programs, or you bring in new beneficiaries to those programs using the existing platforms and modalities. So in the rural areas, there's a massive public works program in Ethiopia, which reaches millions of people every year. They do community infrastructure works. All of those projects were stopped during the lockdown because of social distancing and so on, but payments to participants continued anyway. So they continued to receive their social protection benefits, even though they didn't perform the work that they normally have to do in order to get those benefits. So that's the kind of shock responsive income protection mechanism. In the urban areas, urban workers were very badly affected in Ethiopia. There was food price inflation. Informal traders and others were having to sit at home and not able to earn any income. So they introduced what they called a vertical expansion of the Urban Productive Safety Net program. And this was an increased transfer to people already receiving social assistance through this program. They got enough money to buy 2,100 calories of food per day, even at the higher prices prevailing with inflation. And they got enough money to buy soap and hand sanitizer. And the good thing about this mechanism is they could do it very quickly. They paid directly into bank accounts using existing targeting and registration mechanisms and payment mechanisms. It was very convenient for the beneficiaries. There was no new systems required and no queuing, so complied with social distancing as well. My final case study is South Africa. Here where I'm sitting in South Africa, we have had, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Now you're on mute.
Hi, Stephen. You're on mute now, I think. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it says my speaker is not working, so if
No,
you can't hear me, let me know.
You're sounding good.
Okay, so the social relief of distress grant was introduced to provide some kind of income support to people who are unemployed, not receiving any income, and no access to social grants or unemployment insurance, especially informal workers. And this was not a large amount. It was about $20 a month for 6 months from May to October. But it did provide people some relief at a time when food prices were going high and they had very little access to income and no social protection. It was also done electronically, so you could apply by WhatsApp or by phone or by email. You didn't have to go to the offices or queue. The main problem with this program is that it was new, introduced specifically in response to COVID-19, and therefore they couldn't really use existing targeting mechanisms. And so people had to apply cold, and then they had to be verified by the Department of Social Development, and that took some time. So about 5 million people applied immediately within the first month, And as of now, 3 million have been paid. So it took a couple of months before they managed to get large-scale payments out. And that was mainly because of the verification processes, which are obviously quite slow. And this is because informal workers are outside formal registration and targeting mechanisms. But finally, just to make the last point that I want to emphasize is that on Monday this week, 2 days ago, the Minister of Social Development announced that a basic income grant could be introduced for unemployed working age South Africans. And this would continue after the social relief of distress grant ends in October. So again, it would cover people who are unemployed between 18 and 59 years old and have no access to unemployment insurance or other social grants. In other words, it's filling that gap that I mentioned earlier. We have, as Amrita said, we do have quite a comprehensive social protection system in South Africa, but informal working age people are not covered. And so that's the gap that needs to be addressed, which this intervention would address. Yesterday, the minister suggested that maybe this idea is not actually going to happen. It's only under discussion at the moment, not yet been approved. But the fact that it is being discussed is a positive side effect of COVID-19. And civil society is certainly mobilizing very fast to try to make sure that it happens. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And there were a couple of times when the sound quality just deteriorated a little bit. So people might come back with some questions on if there's a little bit there that they wanted to just pick up on. But thanks for that. And then finally, from our panelists, what are the longer term implications for informal workers, and are there any reasons to be hopeful for longer term change? We're going to have two speakers now to touch on this. I'm going to address this between them. Vanessa van der Boogaard is a political scientist specializing in informal taxation revenue generation, and she's a research fellow at the International Center for Tax and Development, where she co-leads the research program on tax and informality, as well as leading research programs on civil society and gender. And she's based at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And then she'll be followed by Max Gallien, who's a research fellow also at the International Center for Tax and Development and IDS. He's a political scientist specializing in the politics of informal and illegal economies, the political economy of development, and the modern politics of the Middle East and North Africa. And at the International Center for Taxation and Development, he works on informality and taxation with Vanessa alongside ICTD's capacity building program. So Vanessa, I think you'll go first, and then Max will follow.
Great, thank you, Peter. So I have been tasked with Max today to consider the longer term implications of the crisis and with highlighting opportunities for positive change. Sincere apologies from the beginning for all those that are looking to us for a message of hope. Unfortunately, our key message today is that the crisis is not over and it's going to get worse for informal sector workers in particular. We have not yet seen indications of more positive systemic change. And indeed, we see considerable longer term risks for the informal sector in particular. I'll start by highlighting 3 areas of risk in particular. So first, want to highlight the reality that the crisis is reinforcing and exacerbating inequality within and across countries. So while there will certainly be heterogeneous effects given the diversity of the informal sector, it is also certain that COVID is further widening the divide between the haves and the have-nots. We've already discussed today that prior to the pandemic, informal workers were already more vulnerable economically. They were less well represented politically and already faced greater health risks, both because of a lack of access to healthcare and because of frontline exposure to a number of viruses and epidemics, thinking about, from cholera to Ebola to COVID today, where informal workers either are unable to work while having less savings and more limited access to formal social safety nets, or have the choice of working on the front line with limited protection. So they're being forced to make a trade-off between health and economic survival. And this is contrasted with workers who in the formal sector who have higher baseline incomes, savings, access to opportunities and social protection programs, and are more easily able to adapt and work remotely throughout the crisis. So we really see the crisis as reinforcing and exacerbating this pre-existing inequality within countries and globally, and negatively affecting some of the progress made over the last 30 years in poverty reduction. Second, recognizing that the effects of the crisis will be uneven within the informal sector. we see the longer term implications for gender equity as particularly troubling. So with the crisis and, as has already been mentioned, with the closure of schools and childcare facilities, unpaid care and household burdens are growing and are doing so in a gendered way. This is having impacts across the formal and informal sector, across high and low income countries. Globally, we will continue to see the negative impacts for gender equity, but we anticipate that these may be particularly bad for women in the informal sector, where women are often overrepresented and are often less able to grow businesses, are more likely to operate at a smaller scale. So we see the crisis as having longer term implications for women's ability to enter the labor force within the informal sector, to access capital, and to expand their businesses, as well as having an impact on girls' entry and enrollment in schools. And third, we want to highlight a risk that the informal sector will be targeted as a source of revenue for the state in the post-crisis period, with considerable equity implications. So in the post-crisis period, states are going to be, they already are, desperate for revenue. And in some contexts, we've already seen increasing policy and political attention being paid to the quote unquote formalization of the informal sector, the taxation of the informal sector. This impulse, it's often driven by stigma associated with the informal sector, with viewing the informal sector as a center of chaos, of crime, of disorder, a place that the state needs to control. It's also driven by broader narratives of the unfairness of informal sector workers not paying tax, and the reality of often less organized political resistance from informal sector workers relative to wealthier political constituents. But this impulse to tax the informal sector overlooks the reality that first, informal sector workers already pay a range of formal and informal taxes and fees, often receiving little in return. And second, that it would be much more equitable and efficient in terms of revenue to undertake progressive but more politically challenging tax reforms. That would mean a focus on wealth taxes, on income and property taxes for high net worth individuals. And related to this point, we see a risk that some of the social protection and cash transfer programs targeting the informal sector that we see coming out of the crisis will also make the informal sector, the taxation of the informal sector more feasible for the state. So some programs targeting the informal sector require registration with the state in some form. It may not be with the tax authority, with the revenue authority, may mean with the local government by requiring that informal sector workers have hawking or vending licenses in order to receive the benefits, or they may be required to register with the ministries that are in charge of social protection programs. While this registration may be required to administer the benefits in the short term, there is a risk that it will increase the visibility of informal sector workers to the state, making them easier targets for inequitable and regressive post-crisis revenue raising. On that happy note, I will pass to Max and hope that he may be able to share a more positive outlook for the future.
All right, thank you, Vanessa. Well, I think primarily I'm going to continue Vanessa's look at the long-term effects of the current pandemic on informal economies, adding 3 further points around the shifts in the sector, around debt, and around narratives. I will make a brief attempt at trying to find some grounds for optimism at the very end, but I think more broadly, these points too give quite substantive cause for concern for the medium-term future of the sector. And I think they highlight the importance of sustained engagement with informal workers beyond the immediate aftermath of the lockdowns and of the last 7 months. So I think the first point to make here is that the composition of the sector is going to change. Many developing countries are likely to enter a protracted economic crisis. And I think in particular, we're likely to see both a period of high unemployment and the fiscal inability of many states to sufficiently support those who have lost their jobs. And in the past, these conditions have been consistent with the entrance of more people into the informal sector in order to make ends meet. And in the post-COVID context, companies choosing to reduce the hours of their staff could also lead to more people straddling the formal-informal divide through juggling multiple jobs. New entrants into the informal sector likely has multiple effects on informal workers. First, it tends to increase competition in sectors that have large numbers of new entrants, which drives down wages and prices. This is likely to be particularly prevalent in low-skilled activities that already face lower wages and little bargaining power. I think secondly, and critically, we will likely also see the displacement of vulnerable groups from profitable sections of the informal economy by more highly capitalized or skilled formal sector actors. Past examples of this have also shown that these developments can be strongly gendered with the defeminization of profitable sectors of the informal economy. And I think there are good reasons to believe that after a crisis which has hit people at the intersection of market and caring economies particularly hard, this effect might be particularly strong this time around. The second point is that in the medium term, debt burdens within the informal economy are likely to further increase. So we're already noticing in conversations with our partners and in some of our ongoing research that many informal economic actors have taken on additional debts during the pandemic, and especially during periods when they were unable to work. And there is additional concern here that traditional sources of borrowing, such as family networks, might be exhausted or about to be exhausted, leading workers to resort to commercial moneylenders who charge high interest rates or resort to straight up loan sharks. And I think it's hard, if not impossible, to overstate the risk that this implies for informal livelihoods going forward. In the context of a lot of background noise on the importance of access to capital and development, it's important to note just how risky sustained debt burdens can be for informal workers, especially when loans are aimed at consumption, and especially in the current context where their commercial future is so uncertain. And it's notable that here again, state support that reached medium or large-sized formal firms has not reached the informal economy. And it's at this point easier for a microfinance provider to get government support than for a microfinance debtor. And I think that difference is quite crucial. The third factor that I think is quite likely to shape the medium to long-term future of the sector is its perception in the public discourse in the aftermath of the crisis. And I think here too, there is good ground for concern. We've seen that the particular vulnerability of informal workers has at times been twisted to paint them as a public health risk, to deepen stigmas, and as a consequence to further restrict the ability of informal workers to go about their business, or go along with additional attempts at extracting revenue for them under the pretense that they're a danger for nearby communities. But I think there's also a little bit of hope here. So I will use this as a segue to attempt just a tiny little bit of optimism at the end, as Vanessa's let me down on that point. So tiny reasons of optimism, but really digging deep here. And that is also again around the public perception. So I think while the stigma around informality appears to have deepened in many places, we have also seen some recognition of informal workers by states and in public discourse. So there's been some discourse around seeing informal workers as essential workers, and noticing the role that, for example, informal waste collectors and informal workers in the caring economy have played in the pandemic. I think there's been in some cases a recognition that informal workers are part of the national economy, that they're essential to it, that they're closely connected to it, and consequently that they're deserving of government support, which can be quite a stark contrast to a lot of the discourse you often hear about informality otherwise. And I think the crisis has also highlighted that the health of everyone is in the interest of everyone. And hopefully, as Stephen said, has opened some policy space for reforms in that direction. And I think finally, the interest in informality in the development and policy community has increased substantially, as evidenced, amongst other things, by the fact that this is the second event of this type that we've had in a few weeks, and that they tend to be quite popular, and that new discussions are happening around these topics. So some of these, I think, are genuinely positive developments, but they're also largely wins on the symbolic side, and they exist alongside huge threats on the structural and economic sides. So all of this recognition or all this policy interest, I think, will need to translate into meaningful and large scale and structural policy or action, or otherwise we're looking at a really, really dire situation in the medium to long term. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Vanessa, too. And I appreciate, Max, you bringing us a little optimism at the end, but I think both of you have painted a picture of quite a significant challenge, and one which is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. Let's open it up now to questions from participants, and we have been getting a few in. And just to get us going, I'd just like to start by inviting a response from Marty Chen. And Marty is co-founder of the co-founder and international coordinator emeritus and senior advisor of WeGo, the Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing Network, and also lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. So Marty, maybe just a few reflections from your side, perhaps with some questions if you have them as well, and then we'll also continue with questions from participants. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to IDS, and thanks to all the panelists. You've said much of what I would have said, so let me try to just bring it all together in terms of what we knew about informal workers pre-COVID, what we've learned about informal workers during COVID, and what informal workers really want post-COVID. And Hina got off to a good start with the first ever global estimates that there are 2 billion informal workers globally who represent 61% of all workers globally and 90% of workers in developing countries and 67% in emerging countries. It's really only in developed countries that they're a minority at around 18%. And what we also know from these global estimates is that most of them are poor. There's a significant overlap between working informally and being poor. And there is difference, of course, within the informal economy, which Amrita pointed to. And just to say that the vast majority of informal workers are self-employed, but they're not employers for the most part. A very small percentage are employers. Most of them are what are called own account, who are single person operators, head family units, and contributing family workers in those family units. And then of course, there's a range of wage workers who are informal, whether casual day laborers, many domestic workers, a lot of contract workers, a lot of gig economy workers. And what we also know pre-COVID, and this is what Vanessa and Max have alluded to, is that the dominant narratives about informal workers, especially among economists, I'm afraid to say, are largely negative. They are associated with evading taxes and regulations, of operating illegally in some way or dealing in illegal goods and services, of having low productivity, being a drag on the economy, being associated with crime and grime, you name it, they're stigmatized in that way. And they're often penalized and actually criminalized for that. And yet, most are working poor people trying to earn an honest living in a very hostile legal and policy environment pre-COVID, okay? And then we get COVID. And we know, as we've heard, that the virus has spread quickest and fastest and widest within the poorer communities. And we know that the informal workers who live off daily earnings were terribly hit. It was a triple economic crisis, almost from day one. No work meant no food, meant no income, meant no food. And we heard a common lament across the world that we will die from hunger before we die from the virus. We heard that from day one. But then in the process, all of us, rich and poor, began to realize we returned to basics, if you will. We returned to health and food and childcare and all of the basics of life, and realized that these frontline workers were so important to us. And we clapped and we hit pots and pans and we sang to them. But I don't think we fully realized that most of them are informally employed. Most of these frontline workers do not have social protection. And they don't have workers' rights, and they often have pre-existing health and other conditions that make them extremely vulnerable. And so I think both Stephen and Vanessa have alluded to this. And so my way of summing it up is these essential workers lack essential rights. And so we have an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to either go back to the old bad deal for informal workers, or to go I'm afraid there's a real threat of a new worse deal for informal workers, or there's a Pollyanna in me that says, let's get a new, better deal for these workers. And let me just quickly say what the threats are, and I'll use a country I know best, India. It's where I grew up and it's where my heart is. In the wake of COVID, there have been state ordinances suspending unions, suspending labor rights. These were overturned because the ILO director wrote to the government of India at the request of the national trade unions, but there's still that threat. The micro, small, and medium enterprise portfolio of stimulus and all that, they increased the level of investment and turnover so that bigger firms would qualify as medium firms. So there's a risk, like we've seen everywhere, that these stimulus packages actually get captured by bigger businesses, not the very small single person family units. And the corporates in India wanted a 12-hour workday. They said this in the interest of public health. Fewer shifts, fewer workers, less risk, right? With no unions. And I mean, so there's real threats. And we do know, I think it was Amrita referred to, that the infrastructure of natural market street vendors and other groups has been destroyed by the police in Dakar, Senegal, and India, you name it. So there are real threats of reverting to a worse condition, and also because the actual poverty level, the lack of savings all drawn down, the indebtedness of the workers. So there's an opportunity for transformation, and we have to seize it. And one part of the seizing of this opportunity is seizing these dominant narratives that are so negative to informal workers and turning them on their head by saying these are actually the essential workers that we depend on for these basics that we now realize are so important in our lives. And I think with it needs to come, and this is the radical in me, that why do we focus on informality of labor and we don't look at informality of capital, right? You know, in India, again, the IT sector got a tax holiday for the first like 17 years of its existence because they negotiated with government. So government colludes in the informality of capital, but it penalizes the efforts of informal workers to operate in the little spaces and time that is allowed to them, as somehow they're the culprits for informality. I think we just have to expose informality at the tip and the bottom or base of the economic pyramid. And the process of transformation is to welcome and embrace these workers as providing essential goods and services. You think of the whole food chain that Stephen specializes in, and most people involved in the production and distribution, especially the frontline distribution of street food vendors, they're mostly informal, right? And yet we depend on food, depend on milk, we depend on all of these essentials. And so I think we just need to just reset these narratives, and also realize that a lot of our labor regulations and our labor statistics and all of these systems that we have, the models, assume a recognized employer-employee relationship. 44% of all workers, not just informal workers, all workers globally are self-employed. So how do we think about supply and demand of labor if everyone's self-employed in some labor markets, right? And 2/3 to 3/4 of informal workers are self-employed. So there's a real need for a major shift in our thinking and our mindsets and our models of looking at the economy and the workforce. And I'll just end with what the networks in the WIGO network, which are the International Domestic Workers Network, the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers, StreetNet International, and 4 or 5 regional networks of home-based workers want. This is their solidarity platform of demands to governments. They want recognition that informal workers are and always have been essential workers. They're essential to us, they're essential to capitalism, they're essential. The second is the global economy cannot recover unless they too recover. And the third is that the recovery needs to involve a transformation of economies that are reset to embrace rather than stigmatize and penalize informal workers. And I want to add a note that I've written an appeal about in the wake of all the police violence protests in the US. The informal workers are stigmatized not just for what they do, but often for who they are. Because in South Africa, in Brazil, the majority will be Black. In India, the majority will be from low castes, right? And so we're just stigmatizing them out of our lives so that we don't have to worry about them. But now we realize they're essential in the provision of goods and services. So we really have to get over the structural injustices that they face by reason of what they do and who they are. And the three principles of the global solidarity.
Marty, if I could just ask you to round out fairly quickly, because we have got quite a few questions as well that other participants would like to bring.
So do no harm, transform the economy, and nothing for us without us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and sorry for interrupting you there.
No problem. I tend to go on. I'm a college professor.
Well, and also, you know, advocating well, I think, for a truly transformative approach to this. Before I invite panelists to respond to some of the issues you've raised, let me bring in a few points that have come up from our wider audience. I think it would be great just to hear a few of the things which are on their minds. Several points have been raised around universal basic income. So Reinhard Leeds has asked, do we need a global effective response to the vulnerability of informal workers, a universal basic income? And he's suggesting that global institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF should introduce a global universal basic income to cover basic needs, especially food, clothing and housing. And that would not only support informal workers during the pandemic, but also during the ongoing climate crisis. And suggested that could be financed through taxes for use of our global commons, such as resource and waste taxes, and taxes on financial transactions of transnational corporations. Digvijay Singh also notes that currently public works program in India is being used to sustain rural wages and economy, and is universal basic income the way forward? And the suggestion there is that safety nets can provide a critical but limited protection, and UBI is the way forward. And then Nikki Gilbert, who's a PhD student at the University of Reading, thanks the panel for their input, and has a question specifically to Stephen, again about what comes to mind when thinking about universal basic income or universal income grants is about safety nets. So is it time to continue to talk about safety nets instead of transformative measures? And if COVID-19 has revealed the inherent gaps in social protection, what comprehensive springboards are worth considering to strengthen the resilience of informal workers amidst a crisis of any form? So there's a question about, several questions about universal basic income. And I'm just going to throw another couple of questions, and I'll ask panelists then to take the ones that they feel that they can contribute some ideas to. A question in relation to migrants from Professor Hongwei. Migrants form a great percentage of informal sector workers in some countries, and how have governments dealt with migrants in the informal sector in order to protect them from the negative effects of the pandemic? And then a question on tax from Shima Abdin, a question to Vanessa specifically. So for a state desperate for revenues, how can they distinguish between informal workers able to pay tax and others who genuinely can't? So there's a few questions. UBI, and also questions around particular circumstances of migrants, and also questions around tax. So let me bring it back to participants. And maybe, Stephen, I could start with you, because a couple of those questions were directed to you, and then to Vanessa, and then we can invite from others as well.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I'm assuming you can hear me at the moment, but let me know if you can't.
Okay.
The questions around UBI and the transformative approach to social protection are really pertinent and relevant. And right now we have a window. But I fear that to be negative, like some of my colleagues are on the panel, to be a bit cynical about it, is I'm very concerned that the fiscal windows are closing very fast. At the moment, we've seen a very positive Keynesian type of response to the crisis, with lots of money being mobilized to provide protection to informal workers and others in the short term. But what happens when the lockdowns end and we're supposed to go back to normal and they're trying to encourage people back into work? I fear that we might run out of fiscal space then. So we really need to push hard right now. And one of the policy changes that can be made is to try to argue for more rights-based approaches. The problem with social protection in most countries is that it's not rights-based, especially in lower income countries. It's discretionary. So you're lucky if you get a grant from the state, you're lucky if you get public works employment on a project in a village somewhere. But nobody says, I have a right, I can go to the government and I can claim it, except in a few countries, South Africa being one of them, by the way. But even here, informal workers do not have access to social protection as a right. And I think that one of the implications of some of these questions is that we should be able to transform social safety nets into social rights, simply by reminding governments and the international community that most countries have signed up to international declarations on social protection as a human right and the right to food. It's in the Universal Declaration, it's in the Social Protection Floor recommendation that all countries in the world signed up to in 2012, but most governments aren't held to account to deliver on that right. So yes, a transformative approach to social protection would be to transform discretionary safety nets into rights-based claims on the state as a duty bearer. And one way that you could apply this specifically to the issue of informal workers is by delinking entitlement to social protection or to social security from contributions. In other words, if you're unemployed, you have a right to get social protection from the state, whether you made contributions into a social protection or social security fund or not. It should not be based on contributions, it should be based on need. So if we could separate out contributions from formal employment and entitlements to social protection, then you would be able to extend social protection to those informal workers who are currently left out of the systems. I think I'll stop there and I'll come back to the other points later about migrants and so on.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So Vanessa, let me come to you, the question specifically around tax.
Great, thank you. So I think that the question about how to distinguish between formal and informal workers to actually target tax that is more equitable and more progressive is actually, the key message is that it's actually quite simple to identify who should be taxed in a more equitable tax system. I think the first key message from our side would be to stop taxing the informal sector as a baseline. That is not where, stop taxing low income individuals in the informal sector. I should specify there is diversity and there may be high income individuals that would be captured in the informal sector and would be considered as evading tax. But on the whole, if governments focus on direct taxes on income and wealth, it's actually quite simple, and there are technical ways to identify where that income actually exists within the national economy. So just some examples from the International Center for Tax and Development's work in this area. I'll highlight an ongoing project in Freetown in Sierra Leone that is reforming the property tax system, reforming it in a way that is much more progressive. That when this system of valuing houses comes into place, the lower half of the population, the lowest 50% of income, will not be required to pay property tax, and the top 20% will be. And that's actually, through identifying the value of houses. And again, that's actually quite simple to do when there are programs in place. Likewise, we've done considerable work in Uganda focusing on taxing high net worth individuals. So again, revenue authorities have the capacity to identify wealth through looking at assets, income, looking at or using intragovernmental data sharing. It's all possible, and it's actually quite simple to identify who should be taxed. The problem that we see is not in identifying who should be taxed, but the problem is more political in targeting the wealthy within countries. And I think that this is a problem is not solely a problem in low-income countries. We see this globally, that there is political resistance. And going back to some of my earlier points, where informal sector workers are less well organized politically to resist, they may be easier targets for revenue authorities. And this also relates to my previous point about some of the negative and false narratives about the informal sector. As Marty highlighted, there is this idea that a fairly common idea among not just economists, but policymakers as well, that the informal sector is evading tax, that they are representing inequity in the system because they are evading tax, they're not paying tax. We know that this isn't true. Informal sector workers, low-income informal sector workers pay a range of taxes and fees already, but the system as a whole would be much more equitable and progressive if the focus of revenue authorities was predominantly on direct taxes on income and wealth.
Great, thanks, Vanessa. And time is moving on towards the end, so I'm just going to quickly bring out a couple more questions to add to the mix. Let's continue with the one on migration. Perhaps we could pick up with a thought from one of you on that, just how governments are dealing with migrants in the informal sector to protect them from negative effects of COVID. But also a question from Irfan Zagar about what would be the impact of COVID-19 on urbanization in view of reverse migration. And then another interesting question from Ruvimbo Tsiva about what strategies trade unions, which represent informal workers, could use to help change that narrative of informal workers, especially at the government level. So I think we've just got a few minutes just to touch on some pretty deep questions, but let's give it a shot. And maybe I could come perhaps, Hina, first of all to you, and then to Amrita afterwards.
So to just address the question about the urban, economy and how it's going to impact rural-urban migration. So, I mean, this is my view, and this is what I see in Pakistan, where I live, that COVID-19 is an urban crisis, basically, because in Pakistan, we thought that it was really going to disrupt the agri-food supply chain. It was really going to disrupt rural livelihoods, but that has not really happened. So the impact is more in the cities. So I think so people have gone back, but if you go to the rural areas, life is going on as if things are pretty normal. Like, marketplaces are open, people are small informal markets are operating. It's the cities where, and in cases in Pakistan where urbanization is really haphazard, cities have not grown, there are no master plans. So these fractures have become more obvious now. So I think the larger question is really brings, to the forefront is how are our cities growing and what can we do to make our urban centers more resilient to the COVID crisis. So, from that point of view, I feel like it is an urban crisis. We expected the rural economy to be impacted much more, but it hasn't. And the impact has largely been restricted to the urban centers. And that is where we see the health infrastructure being overwhelmed as well. So I think the urban poverty and, urban livelihoods, that's really something that we need to think about and when these shocks come again, it's not going to be the last pandemic that is going to hit this planet. So we need to start developing our cities to cope with this.
Thanks, Hina. Amrita, just a closing thought from you.
Yes, thanks, Peter. So I wanted to just make a brief comment. I think Marty said, she mentioned about the existing structural injustices, as well as, Stephen talked about the rights-based approach. So I think in terms of interventions that are being announced, if we are able to use this moment as a point of transformation where we account for the differences and kind of account that not just financial responses in terms of tax, but accounting that even if there is a utility fee waiver, which will cover the scope of the informal sector, how can these reach out and provide access based not just on kind of their existing position in the economy, but sort of a more rights-based approach tackling really at the core of that question about access and reaching out. I think that would be really the question that in my opinion would be key for kind of moving forward in terms of the informal sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita. Max, very quick comments about the trade union question.
Yeah, I can, I mean, on Ruvimbo's question about trade union strategies, I think it's, I mean, first of all, to echo Marty's point that I think it's hugely concerning to see, especially in India, but also in a more global context, the pushback against labor movements that we've seen and the threatening of labor movements. And I think it's important to recognize that informal workers' rights are workers' rights, and that even though it's often an uneasy alliance and an uneasy relationship, there's a relationship between workers' rights movements and informal workers more widely. But if we think about strategies, I think it's to again re-emphasize the essential nature of informal workers and their role in the economy that Marty mentioned as well. But I think there's also an opportunity to internationalize this discussion. I think as Stephen said, I think the fiscal space in many developing countries in particular is constraining very, very quickly, and it was never that big in the first place. And I think we're moving from an era of spending in the last couple of months into an era of fiscal tightening very, very quickly. And if we think about the ideologies and the strategies and the policies that have come with these types of austerities in the past, they've been incredibly toxic to informal workers and incredibly presented a very difficult environment to move forward these kinds of discussions. But they also tend to internationalize. They tend to internationalize through appeals to donors, to appeals to international financial organizations. So I think also taking this opportunity to internationalize these discussions and have a global discussion around these issues is a really, really interesting window, and one that we can all contribute to.
Thanks, Max. And again, you brought us around to a slight note of optimism, at least to give us a sense of direction going forward, which I think we all appreciate. Time has beaten us. It would be great to hear even more from the panelists because I think there's a lot more to be said about all of these questions. There are some links that have been put in the chat box if participants would like to take a look at those, but I'm afraid that we will have to bring this conversation to a close. It's one that's going to continue, but let me say a sincere thanks to Hina, Amrita, Stephen, Vanessa, Max, and also to Marty for your insightful comments as well. Thanks to our colleagues behind the scenes, James and Gary, for helping to facilitate this, and also to participants from wherever you may be for joining us on Zoom and YouTube. This is a conversation that will continue. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and look forward to continuing engaging with you on this. Bye for now.